Okay, well, as I said, thank you for joining this afternoon's webinar in association with TransferMate. So just before we start, let's run through the housekeeping. Obviously, we are live streaming and recording this webinar today, and the slides and recordings will be available at the end of the webinar. So we just need to put them up on our website and an email will be sent to you. If you do have any questions, can you please add them to the Q&A box? Because of Zoom at the moment and, you know, everyone's on Wi-Fi, Gary and myself will be taking ourselves off camera shortly, just so that there's no interruption to today's webinar. So we have been talking about international payments quite a lot within the payroll industry, and a lot of, well, not a lot, quite a few of our members have actually told us about their concerns about physically paying people. So I'm happy to say today that Gary has come along to speak about this. So we're going to be talking about that and how to make your international payments process more cost effective and reliable. So we do want this to be interactive. Feel free to ask any questions and we will answer them at the end of today's webinar. So I'm just going to pass this over to you then, Gary, if you want to introduce yourself to everyone.
Great, thanks. So yeah, for anyone that won't be able to see my face during the webinar, they can remember this lovely photo when we were allowed to be in our offices. So obviously those days are gone for the moment. So yeah, I've been in between financial services and technology for pretty much my whole career. So formerly with Goldman Sachs, and then Kindle Banking Systems that got acquired by Mises, that got acquired by Finastra, and then really for the last 15 or so years, specifically on the payment side of the house. So was with a e-com gateway, so on the merchant acceptance side, on a scaling fintech that got bought by Global Payments based out of Atlanta, and so now with TransferMate Global Payments. So TransferMate specializes in payments from for businesses from one bank account to another bank account. So we're a bank rail specialist, and we process payroll for the likes of Uber, for Harvard, for AbbVie, in pharma R&D. So there you go. I'm a banking and payments nerd, unfortunately. So yeah, and I think, you know, what I wanted to talk about today was really about streamlining the payroll and the payments process. So what are the complexities that you're trying to simplify? What are the things that you have to look out for? And how does that apply, I suppose, in particular in this current climate? So anyone has any questions at any stage, please feel free, and we'll probably just come to all the questions at the end of it or so. So Mel, if you want to just go on to the next slide. Great, thank you. So, you know, complexity, I suppose, when dealing with payroll processing, it becomes, you know, more complex the more that you go international. And that's true of payroll. It's also true of payments itself. So, you know, already today in the US, for example, payroll processors account for about 40% of all the payroll payments. So, you know, there's already a recognition that even when dealing just in country, that there's a good deal of complexity. And where does that complexity come from? Well, you know, so what are you actually doing when you're processing the payroll? Well, the first thing is your calculation. So looking at the time and the hours worked, going through the gross to net calculations. And of course, within that, you'll have different elements of withholding tax, income tax, and that can differ not only on a national perspective, but also regionally or within state, or you might have, you know, regional and local elements to that as well. And of course, within those gross net calculations, you're also looking at things like bonuses, various deductions, pension contributions, how are you treating benefit in kind taxation, etc. So, and really what we're trying to do within those calculations is making sure, firstly, that the rights of your employees are protected. So, you know, when you're looking at compliance, there's the taxation element that you have to withhold, report, and ultimately pay to the entity that is due those payroll taxes. But also, so like in the US, that'll be the IRS equivalent. But also then, the Department of Labor looking at the employee rights, because obviously that's where a lot of the fine elements can come from a compliance perspective. If you're violating any wage laws or labor laws, etc. And I think, with regard to the compliance pieces, you've got the welfare, you've got the tax piece, but actually a lot of those compliance with laws can become more complicated and more niche when you go internationally as well. So, you've got, OFAC and other rules from a compliance perspective, ensuring that you're complying with, anti-money laundering standards. In Europe, we have the GDPR. So in terms of personal data, how are you treating that? How are you retaining that? And how are you protecting that information? And indeed, such as in the UK, for example, we have gender pay gap reporting. So, from 2017, any organization with more than 250 employees has to publish and report on those figures around the gender pay gap. So you can see how, it's already complex from an in-country or domestic perspective, but as you start to go internationally, that complexity starts to expand. And as I was saying, that's true for payroll, but no less so from a payment perspective. So the actual delivery of that payroll in terms of how you fund that. So are you doing that from, for example, is that through a reverse wire in the US? Are you using a faster payment system in the UK? Is that a payment initiation? Is there a different direct debit mandate that you're required to sign? What are the clearing periods associated with that? If you're paying internationally, obviously there's an FX charge that can become due. Do you know what that FX charge is that you're paying? What about if you're funding in advance of payroll? How do you lock in that FX component? And then making sure the different timings that come with international and cross-border payments. How do you know that that payment is going to hit on exactly the value date of when your employees are due to get paid? And how do you know that it's going to get hit in full, that there's no deductions, not from a tax perspective, but from a bank fee perspective? So in terms of lifting fees or receiving fees, obviously you want your employees to get paid on a particular date, but you want them to get paid in full for their full salary amount to ensure that you're complying with your regulations of treating your employees fairly. So if we hit the next slide there, Mel. So we can see that one of the challenges that often comes is that businesses, when they're trading internationally, will often grow kind of organically. So, and if we look on the left-hand side, maybe you're a UK company and you're expanding out to the US. So, maybe you're processing that payroll yourself, but now you've started to expand out to other territories. You have a slight presence in Australia, but maybe you don't have a full entity there. You don't have full bank accounts yourself. So you're actually going to use a processor for Australia to assist you with your Australian payroll, but you do the UK yourself and you have some employees in the US. Maybe they're different platforms, different systems, even internally, and of course different fund flows. But I think the same is true also in often cases when you're using a processor. So a lot of companies will say, well, I'm using a global processor to do my payroll, so it's fine. They'll take care of it. But just because something may be outsourced, you may have effectively outsourced complexity. But I think the question that you have to ask yourself is, have you mitigated the risk? Because if your payroll processor is really an aggregator and they're still using lots of different in-country providers in the background, they still have to deal with that complexity. So maybe you don't have to deal with it, But if they have to deal with it, you're not really mitigating the risk. The phrase where you can't necessarily outsource the problem. I think it's also true from a payroll perspective. And of course, alongside all of the processors, there's the actual payment systems as well. So from a bank accounts and funds flow, and how automated is all of that process. So what you'll often find is when companies will get to a certain stage, they will then start to ask themselves the question, well, actually, do I need to look for a partner that is truly global in a way that is standardized, that they're able to, that they've got a global presence with, local presences on the ground. There's one point of contact from a support perspective. That support is available on a 24/7 basis, so that I know if there's any issues with my payroll in any of the countries, that I can actually contact that processor. And indeed, as you get more sophisticated, what are the options for integrating with my HR and human capital management systems? So is it a fully integrated process, or how many elements have to be manual? Do I have to key in elements? What do I have in terms of files that are being exported and imported from one system to another one? So I think just one of the things to be aware of here is, what are the processes that are going on in the background if you're using a processor? Is that really an aggregator, or is that a standardized platform that has replicable processes across all the different territories? So I think those are things to consider when you go international. And of course, on the next slide, Mel, if you want to just go on, the other things to consider at the moment from an international perspective is the environment that we're all living in. So, I think, everyone working from home presents its challenges that I'll go over in a slide. And, part of that, myself and Mel having to go off video, for example, because, Zoom is starting to get overloaded. But actually, the first challenge, often is actually making payroll. So in terms of actually, paying your employees and ensuring that you can do that. So there are supports available, within different jurisdictions, to help companies be able to make their payroll. So if you take, the UK as the example, so, if your operations have been, severely affected by, coronavirus, the current, pandemic, you can, the new word that's entered the lexicon, right, is to furlough employees and apply for a grant. And a lot of different countries have taken, the 75, 70 or 80% of the usual, monthly costs, and potentially there's a cap on that. In the UK, I think that's at the moment £2,500, is the cap on that monthly wage cost. But you can claim up to 80% of that otherwise. And, right now that's in place for the next, 3 months, I think, starting from the beginning of March. But no doubt, and particularly over the last, couple of days, I think there has been a lot of talk about, not only social distancing, but effectively a lot of the lockdown conditions being extended for, a period of time. So, whether that scheme continues to be extended for while we're all living under the conditions of lockdown and social distancing. Secondly, you need to consider, well, what happens if your employees are actually either get sick, or they have to self-quarantine and self-isolate because potentially they've been in contact through contact tracing with somebody who was sick, or there's a member of their family that they have to self-isolate for that reason. So, from a sick pay rebate scheme, there's also supports in place. So you can cover up to 2 weeks, so covering the period of quarantine and self-isolation. And indeed, then from a self-employed perspective, there's also supports there. And, interestingly, you have to have submitted your self-assessment returns for for 3 years previous in order to be eligible, but you get to claim a grant again, 80% being the magic number, for the profits that you would have otherwise had during that period. So you can look over your average over the last number of years and see what that would have been, and obtain that support. So there's some great fiscal measures being brought out to be able to help you make your payroll, to help you pay employees that are from a sick pay perspective, and indeed from a self-employed support perspective. Other fiscal supports that are available, obviously not necessarily, payroll related, but you can defer your VAT payment. You've got business rates relief, between this year and next. And specifically for those industries that are hardest hit from retail, hospitality and leisure, there are grants. And then depending on whether your turnover is over or under £45 million, you can access loans of, if it's over, up to 25 million, and if it's under, for up to 5 million. So there's, considerable support from a business interruption perspective. And, it's similar in other jurisdictions. In the US, the $2 trillion stimulus and the CARES Act, so coronavirus aid, relief and economic security. So there's the concept of helicopter money and, checks directly into people's bank accounts, the direct deposits, and doubling for couples. And of course, from a payment perspective, obviously, interesting for companies like my own as to how that is all dispersed and when it can go directly into people's bank accounts. Because again, if you think about, just as with your normal business, if you have to mail out checks or do other things, that can take a very long time. You really want that money to be available instantly. So there's a very good link there on the right-hand side of that page. If you look at the US Chamber of Commerce, to look at what has each government been doing to provide those fiscal supports. So, for anyone that's interested, take a look at that link, and it will show you across the UK, the US, and in fact all over the globe, what the different supports are for different businesses, and with links to the pages that allow you to apply. From the UK, I'm not sure all the online services are available yet, but certainly by the end of the month, the goal and aspiration is to have all of the application for all of those fiscal supports to be available online on that website. But a useful link there on the right-hand side. So, Mel, if you want to just go on to the next one. So, see, the other thing to consider, again, streamlining your process, there has been no better test of business continuity that organizations will have. The current pandemic, the two things that it's really done has, for companies that are still able to operate, is number one, really accelerate the digitalization of the business, because everyone working remotely. And number two really is the business continuity aspect to it. So, from a payroll perspective, no less than any other function within an organization, who are the key people that are responsible for performing those activities? Are they able to perform all of those activities remotely? Are those staff available? Is there sufficient, redundancy in place from the perspective of there being, multiple members who can actually facilitate and execute the payroll? There's, significant, impact from a perspective of working from home. So potentially there are arrangements that need to be in place from a working from home perspective. It's gotten a lot of press, in the UK and Ireland over the last couple of days around, the grants and entitlements that the politicians have to allow them to be able to work from home. I think, most of us, who maybe haven't worked from home before, kind of make do with, your laptop on top of an ironing board, and you kind of make do with what you have to be able to work from home. But potentially there's some entitlements and ways that companies can help facilitate those employees that are working from home. And of course, do those employees have the appropriate infrastructure? So, in terms of the laptop, in terms of the connectivity from Wi-Fi and internet and remote enablement, and where systems actually need to be, exposed to the internet to allow employees to be able to work with them. So are they native cloud applications, or is there work that needs to be done? Does there need to be VPN connections? What is it that you need to be able to access your payroll systems? And that is also true in the case of where you've had previously physical processes that then need to be digitized in terms of authorizations and filings in particular. So between pay slip stubs, between signings from an authorization perspective, all those processes have to be replicated digitally. And just as mentioned on the other items, these items are all true for payroll, but no less so from a payments perspective, particularly from the authorization perspective. So in terms of releasing and authorizing bank payments, is that a process that everyone can carry out digitally? So I think on the next slide, Mel, I think we're kind of asking a lot of the audience and the participants what they have found to be the biggest challenges. So if you want to take the poll here.
Yeah, I'll launch the poll. So the questions are, or the question is, what are your main challenges right now with payroll? So is it lockdown, remote working, volatile payroll providers, information obtaining assistance, unexpected unexpected fees due to process changes, business environment, cash flow? So I'm going to launch that now. Sorry, that should be unexpected fees due to process changes. I've got something right. We've got an extra one in there, haven't we? So ignore that one. Sorry about that, Gary.
No problem. I see. I'm not allowed to vote. I'm kind of curious as
you're not allowed to. No.
As a panelist, yeah. And I think my suspicion is that the answers are really often depend on what industry the audience is in, because for certain businesses, obviously, cash flow is a huge issue, and how much does the government fiscal supports really contribute to that cash flow? Have they actually been able to obtain those supports, or in the interim are they making their own adjustments quickly and as soon as possible themselves to ensure that cash flow is in place, or is it in fact just the lockdown and everyone being remotely, just the challenge of trying to get the job done on a day-to-day basis?
Okay. So there's a few people that haven't voted, so we'll just give it like 30 seconds if you want to just put your vote through, or 20 seconds. There you go. We've got a few more that have voted now. Before I show the results, what do you think is going to be the top one then, Gary?
Putting me on the spot. I mean, I think it would be the last one, business environment and cash flow. So the main challenge, obviously, the consumer is the biggest driver of demand and economic growth. And we've seen, I mean, I think that the stats coming from the US are frightening. Even now, I think it was another 6 million that went onto the unemployment register. So in the last 4 weeks, I think it's been 22 million people have applied for first time unemployment assistance. So that kind of environment, I imagine, is really from a cash flow perspective. But you never know. I may be surprised. We'll find out in a minute, I guess.
Yeah, I think you may be slightly surprised. But I'm going to end the poll and then I'll show it to everyone. Okay. So the top one is the lockdown and remote working.
And you know what? It's probably, I think, I mean, that's really encouraging to hear, to be perfectly honest, because if one of the biggest challenges for people is the ability to work remotely, then if that's coming above the business environment and cash flow, that's actually a really nice thing to hear, because it means that it's more the practical nature of carrying out the task as opposed to worrying about having the cash to be able to continue business operations. So hopefully that's good news for most people. It's challenging times, but as long as we're able to continue to operate, I think we'll count our blessings, and at some stage, we'll be through the other side of all this, right?
That's right. Well, to be honest with you, we've had a few meetings with senior payroll managers, and cash flow has actually come up there as one of the issues that they're having to deal with. So it's definitely, even though it may not be the highest one here, I know it is when we are speaking to our members. So I will go back on mute, and I'll go on to the other slide for you.
Great, thanks, Mel. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, right? So and a lot of it can be timing. A lot of it, I think particularly for a lot of startup organizations, and even within our own industry, the financial services and fintechs, I imagine there's a lot that are struggling. Like Transmate, I suppose, are just fortunate enough in terms of some of the fundraising. We've already raised 51 million. From the likes of ING, Allied Irish Bank, and we're partnered with the likes of Wells Fargo, etc. So, it just kind of like looking back, very pleased that we went out to get funding when we did, because I think particularly for younger organizations that maybe don't have the balance sheet, it's going to be a challenging environment. But yeah, so I mean, really in the next kind of a half, what I just wanted to go through was the specifically the payment piece, right? So, and there's a lot of analogies to the first half of what we went through in terms of, can you outsource risk? Do you really understand what's happening under the covers? And how do you make it the most efficient, streamlined, and simple and well-controlled process that you can? So if you want to just hit the next slide. I think there's a term that I love here, which is payroll leakage. So I have stolen that from consultants that are no doubt more highly paid than myself to come up with terms like payroll leakage, which really just at a simple level, kind of talks about unintended spending or unexpected items, that are related to payroll activities. So, that can either be, there's a poorly designed process, what we're supposed to be doing in our policy and what we're doing in practice, don't exactly match up. So, in Deloitte's report, they were more talking about, I think, like excessive overtime pay. So we have a policy around that, but in practice it, doesn't match up. So you're paying too much, and that can be considered leakage. Or poor grant management. So, you're not taking full advantage of the supports that are available to you. But actually, I think one of the prime areas for payroll leakage is in payments, and particularly with regard to international payments. So, as an organization, do you understand what you're paying from a wire fee perspective? So do you understand what your processing fees are? Not only for, again, for you sending it out, but are there, any lifting or receiving fees on the other side? Where you have that cross-currency component, what's the FX rates that you're paying? And what does that look like for each currency pair? Because they can differ, So if I'm going from sterling to dollar, that's considered a major currency pair. So it might be one particular foreign exchange rate. But what if I'm going from sterling to Kenyan shilling? What FX rate am I paying then? So you can often have different FX rates for your majors, your minors, and your exotics. What about if, in order to combat that exchange rate, I maintain currency balances? So, and what about I actually, if I have a local or a network of local accounts that I'm maintaining, there's other reports, the likes of KPMG and PwC, that will tell you that it's, to maintain a business bank account and all the peripheral processes that are associated with that, including, bank fees and audit fees and everything else, can cost between, $15,000 and $20,000 per annum. So, what do you actually have in terms of payroll leakage if you're maintaining those accounts? Really, for a payroll perspective, do you need to maintain them otherwise? Do you have a two-way flow? So, those are all things to consider from the payment perspective. And then, from the funding options, what do you have? Are you funding via reverse wire, where there's potentially no clearing period involved there? And do you ultimately have your processor take complete control, not only of the payments from a payroll perspective to your employees, but also remittance to the tax authorities as well? And is that, do you have reports around the accuracy on that to make sure you're not getting hit with fees, late fees, fines? Is the full value being received on the date that is specified to process? And in fact, it's a question. Can you, even when you're doing your payroll, if that's pre-funded and you're paying in, potentially 10 days in advance from a global payroll perspective, can you specify the value date of the payments that are going out to your employees? And how do you confirm the accuracy of those payments? And particularly from a new employee perspective, right? So are you checking that the account details you're depositing the salary payments into, are actually live and correct accounts? So are you doing things like, penny drops and penny tests in those accounts to make sure that the account is live and that the amounts are received? So when it comes time for the monthly payroll, that you have confidence that you're not going to get any rejections, and that, you are treating your employees fairly under the regulations, to ensure that they're actually going to receive their pay on the regular basis that they're entitled to. So a lot of that is around the control, the automation, and the tracking. And I think just as we talked about within the payroll scenario, that is your processor more of an aggregator, or do they actually have full control over the underlying process? The same is true from an international payment perspective. So if you go on to the next slide there, Mel, you can see that, on the left-hand side, traditionally the way cross-border payments are made is through a system that is called international wires. The banks will have what they call correspondent banking relationships with banks that are in territories where they're not regulated. So, let's say I use, Barclays as my main bank today. Barclays licensed in the UK. Barclays, let's just say, have a clearing relationship in the US then with Bank of America that they use in the US, for example. So you end up having these change of correspondent banking relationships, and potentially there can be multiple correspondent banking relationships, which can make it very opaque, particularly when you get to the more exotic markets. So I might have a relationship with Bank A, they in turn have a relationship with Bank B, because they cover the exotic markets more efficiently. But all the banks in those chains need to get paid. And that's the whole reason for the fee structure that you see when you're sending, international payments, that there are sending fees and receiving fees, is that there's a critical path, which means that any delays at any bank will cause a delay to the payment. All those parties have, sending and receiving fees, and potentially, the message that gets to the other end can get lost, and that can cause, reconciliation issues. So, one of the alternative ways that, is looked at to avoid that pass the parcel process is, and this is a question to ask your payroll provider, from a payment perspective, are you making that transfer locally? So, instead of using that correspondent train, am I going to be paying fees? Do I have confidence that you are paying from a local account within the territory where I have to pay? So, when you're paying the US, that actually you're using a provider that has an account or partners with a payment organization that has an account in the US that can use the local rails, that doesn't go through that correspondent banking system, but instead goes through the local clearing system. So, in the UK, obviously there's different clearing systems. So there's, as well as BACS, there's faster payment. In the US, you have the wire system, but you also have the ACH, local system. And, again, by using the local systems, you can have confidence that you're not going to get hit with those fees. You can be sure that the amounts that your employees are getting are actually, the full amount of their salary. So, I think making sure and scratching at the surface and digging under the covers, the same as you would with your payroll processor when you're asking, are you using other in-country providers? Are you aggregating? The same question should be asked, of your payroll provider. What payment organization are you partnering with to make these payments? Are they using the international wire system, or are they using, local transfers? And, again, so what is there from a fee perspective, and do you have clarity and transparency from an FX perspective as well as to what's actually being charged? And all those things combined will ensure that you reduce down the level of leakage, of payroll leakage that you see. So, where you see that, from the Deloitte report that they can see, payroll leakage to 2.5%, a very significant number, given for a lot of companies, the proportion, of their overall revenue that salary will take. There's significant savings to be made by running that as efficiently and streamlined as possible from a payment perspective. So I think just on the last slide there, Mel, you want to go on? Really just, reiterating some of the things that we're talking about in terms of, if you're partnering with both a payroll organization and a payments organization that is truly global, you can have a standardized process. That means your staff are not dealing with a mix and match approach, dramatically reduce their administration. They're not having to chase down, errors, for example. They're not having to maintain multiple processes and complexity, and the additional cost that will come with that. By doing the payments intelligently, you can also reduce your funding cycle. So the whole cycle from funding to execution can be shortened, and you have full visibility, full track and trace from an end-to-end perspective, with zero charges and all the salary being received. So I think, the payment piece is one component of it, but it really mirrors a lot of the best practice that you'll see when using other payroll processors in terms of standardization, making sure you know what's happening under the covers, using the most efficient, intelligent, accurate, software partners and payment rails that you can, and all those things together, particularly when you're dealing with international payroll, will really add up, to savings of potentially, according to the Deloitte report, up to 2.5%. And in fact, when I factor in things like, like FX and payment fees, I'd say you could probably double that to looking at potentially, 5%, because obviously that report didn't even reflect things like, FX rate and banking fees. So hopefully there's some lessons or some nuggets that people will take out of that in terms of streamlining their payroll and their international payments process. And unless there's anything else, I think we're probably going to go on to questions, right?
Yes, we are. Thanks, Gary. So a question that we have is, do you foresee that there will be any further sort of complications going forward to make international payments due to the current crisis?
Yeah, and I think again, we've seen in the poll that it's difficult doing things remotely, but I would hope that everyone's banking services are available remotely, that they're not reliant on a branch network, which may be restricted, but even though it is restricted in all territories, will be considered an essential service. I get right that banking and financial services are an essential service. So that's I think I saw in the news yesterday in Florida, and I suppose it depends where you're asking, but in Florida, the World Wrestling Entertainment Association, WWE, was considered an essential service. So I think they were holding WrestleMania. They were still live streaming it. So I'm not quite sure how that is an essential service, but certainly financial services. So the banks and the likes of Transformate, are considered an essential service. Fortunately for Transformate, we already have everyone working remotely. But if you do have to, go into a branch infrastructure, you should be able to do it. Now, there may be specific challenges or delays, and I think largely that is very much going to be related to physical processes. So there may be, skeleton staff from an operational perspective. We have seen that we've still been able to operate normally. I think for any company that is relying on paper processes and checks, for example, undoubtedly there are delays from that perspective. But from a banking perspective, payments is essential, and really, I think is often considered like a utility. It needs to work. It needs to be reliable. It's part of the core national infrastructure. So fortunately, it's recognized as such within all the jurisdictions as an essential service. So, I think we'll continue to get through this, and I would expect that most financial services operations will operate as normal, at least from a payment perspective. I don't know if there's anyone listening from, if we have any banks in the audience. I think there were a couple, Mel, that were on the attendee list. But I think from a banking perspective, while the payments is still working, all the focus is on the credit side of the house. So, what is my exposure to my existing credit book? How can I help the companies with their working capital to ensure that they have sufficient cash flow to get through this, but really understanding the positions that they hold from a credit perspective has probably taken up a lot of the time. And fortunately, payments has been relatively less affected, I would say.
I think also some of our members have found that some of the banks in some of the countries are closing early. So they've had to bring things forward to make sure that people get paid on time or get paid a day earlier. So it's how to monitor that side of things as well.
Yeah, and I think just working closely with your providers, either your direct partners from a payments institution or bank or financial service, or indeed your payroll processor. The key to your cash flow is going to be that funding cycle. So I think even some of the points that we touched on are even more critical in this time. So I mentioned funding options, for example. So you have to think about if you're funding your payment cycle by debit, for example. If your processor can take a debit from your account, there can be up to a 5-day clearing period for those funds to be cleared good funds in your processor's account. So choosing a funding method that ensures that you don't have those delays. So for example, in the US, you're doing a reverse wire. In the UK, obviously you can do faster payment up to $250,000, and then either multiple payments, or you can use the BACS or indeed the CHAPS rail for, for high value payments that are sent the equivalent of wire. So how do you fund your processor? And if there have been delays from a banking perspective that you need to fund a day earlier, are you funding in the right way in any case? Are you getting the money there as quickly as possible? And of course, do you have transparency over what you need? So if there's an FX component to what you have, do you know exactly how much you need? Because particularly from an FX perspective, I think more so than a payments perspective, it's, the markets and the stock markets have been a wild ride, but likewise, the currency markets have been a wild ride. And I think what you've seen in the pandemic is that the strength of the dollar has come out again. So the dollar is always a safe haven, in times of crisis, and even more so, I think, for this particular pandemic. So if you are, I suppose, unprepared from an FX perspective, you could get hit with funding costs because of FX volatility that you maybe didn't cater for. So I think, as well as getting the payment there in time, doing it, reducing that funding cycle and reducing your exposure from an FX perspective is critically important when you have very volatile currency markets out there.
Okay, we have another question. This one's slightly longer. We have a variety of different payment platforms in use across 30 plus countries. As an immediate contingency, I'm looking for a single global provider to act as a backup. Would there be payment providers out there that would have an appetite to provide such a contingent service?
Yeah, so obviously, again, from a Transmate perspective, we operate globally, right? So you have up to 60 funding currencies that we operate in. So you can fund in up to 60 currencies, and then we pay out in up to 180. One of our sister companies, Immedis, has a global payroll platform as well. So it's a nice symbiotic relationship within our wider group of companies that Transmate forms the payments. Immedis has that global payroll platform, but both our companies operate on a global basis and a global scale. I mentioned the fact that we've processed for the likes of of Uber, of AbbVie, of Harvard, etc. So I think there are we'll certainly stick our hand up, Transmate and Immedis as well, and there are I think other platforms, both as and indeed the redundancy point is well made, making sure that you have a backup for all things, and again I suppose what you want to do is if you're using someone that as a backup, you want to make sure any of the providers they're using in turn aren't duplicated as well, so making sure that you have true redundancy. So it's one of the things from Transmate's perspective that we look at, for example, when we're entering into new territories, is our redundancy of banking provider, to make sure that you always have an alternative that you can turn to. I think it's very sensible from a redundancy perspective, and to even apart from a redundancy, to be able to split things, to ensure that the capability exists across more than one partner. But undoubtedly, I think what we're trying to get through in the whole presentation is the different layers that are involved in payments, just as in payroll. So partnering is generally a choice that someone will do in a considered way, and make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and all the funds are safeguarded with tier one reputable partners, and that insurance and bonds are in place against the different accounts, and there's full compliance with all the local regulations. So it's important that whoever you choose, you make sure you do the diligence to ensure that they are robust enough, both from a process perspective, and in this current climate, I'd suggest from a balance sheet perspective as well, any company that's sitting in a healthy balance sheet, is fortunate to be able to have, the financial strength to see them through times like these.
Okay, then that's actually the last question we have, Gary. So I think we'll come to an end. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Oh, actually, we have one more question. Let me just check this. I know somebody has actually asked whether or not we will be sending out the presentation, which we will do, and also the recording. But before we go, Gary, is there anything else that you wanted to add at all, or just to share?
No, everyone stay safe. 2 meters, 6 feet, right? Enjoy your social distancing. So we'll come out the other side of this. And of course, if anyone wants to contact me directly, the last question, obviously, I mentioned we're happy to put our hands up. I'd go through, if anyone wants a demo of the Transformate system or to be connected with our sister company, Amitis, you find me on Twitter at Gary P. Conroy or email me directly, gconroy@transformate.com. And wishing you a safe lockdown and see you on the other side.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Thanks a lot, Mel. Thanks everybody.
Thanks for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.